When members of the official opposition grasp at straws to criticize this agreement, I'm left to wonder if they realize that it's Putin's agenda that they're advancing when they do so.
I find your comment in your opening remarks that criticizing or finding things to criticize within a trade agreement is somehow helping Vladimir Putin to be somewhat despicable. I think that's an unacceptable comment to make about other members of Parliament. Secondly, Conservative members of Parliament unanimously support Ukraine, and your insinuation that somehow we don't, I also find somewhat contemptuous. Turning to the trade agreement itself, can you tell me which section in the Canada-EU free trade agreement has a mention of carbon pricing or a carbon tax?
Well, let me begin on your comments around my opening remarks. I think to suggest that the government of Canada took advantage of Ukraine when exactly the opposite was done was something that I should put on record and clarify. When a member calls this legislation woke, I would like to suggest what would woke mean. Is it because there are progressive elements in it that protect the environment, that provide opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses, that for the very first time has a chapter for Indigenous trade opportunities? And to your question around the EU free trade agreement, we're so proud of CETA because of its standards.
Proportional time for question and response. So what section in CETA has a carbon tax or a carbon price?
CETA has provisions that protect the environment.
It does not have anything in there on a carbon tax or a carbon price. CPTPP, what section of CPTPP talks about a carbon tax or a carbon price?
I respect those questions, but I thought I was here talking about Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement. If
you don't know the answer to the question, you can just say that, Minister. What section of CPTPP has a carbon price or a carbon tax in it?
What I would say is that in those agreements, CPTPP and in CETA, there are strong provisions to protect the environment. And it's in fact those very provisions where you are seeing reports from the chief economist where exports by Canadian exporters, particularly around environmental goods, have actually increased. So there are good benefits for Canadian businesses.
But there's no actual section that mentions a carbon price or a carbon tax in either of those agreements. Is that correct?
Both of those agreements have strong environmental provisions, and we're really proud about that.
If you can't answer the question, that's fine. What about in CUSMA? What section in CUSMA has a carbon tax or a carbon price in it? You can just tell us the section. If you don't know, you can say, I don't know, rather than talking about other aspects of that agreement.
Well, I like to talk about the other aspects of the agreement because they actually are really good for Canadian businesses, and they put us on the strength of being able to build towards economies that are going to increasingly fight climate change, but
no one's
also trade opportunities.
No one's disputing the value of trade agreements. I'm asking you what sections in those trade agreements include a carbon price or a carbon tax. If you don't know the answer, which you seem to not, I will tell you none of them have that in those trade agreements. Absolutely zero. So why would you include in a trade agreement at a country in the middle of a war a carbon tax? How can that possibly help Ukraine? You talked about aiding Vladimir Putin. Putting a carbon tax into a trade agreement absolutely aids Vladimir Putin.
Well, let me share with you, and I think you know, and I think you would agree, that the energy sector is really important to the Canadian economy. And in fact, it was on the signing of this, the completion of this agreement by the two leaders of the country, that AECON group here in Canada, along with Ukraine Hydro Energo, signed a cooperation agreement to develop a partnership agreement on the construction of hydroelectric power plants in Ukraine. It's agreements like this, it's an agreement like this that actually enables companies to do exactly that around providing energy security and to work with Ukraine as they are rebuilding so that they are not only fighting climate change, but they are actually dealing with energy security in the country.
That's interesting. You didn't answer my question, which is fine, but that's interesting on energy security. You've got absolutely nothing in this trade agreement on energy security, do you? There's no chapter on it, but there's a chapter that puts in a carbon tax. Am I correct there?
This agreement is a terrific agreement because it provides the conditions for businesses to be a part of that rebuild effort in Ukraine, and you saw that with this really important Canadian company that builds all around the world, and certainly to do a hydroelectric power plant in Ukraine, I think is something quite remarkable. So I congratulate that company.
Where's the section in the agreement that talks about electric capacity generation or natural gas development? Ukraine has some of the largest natural gas deposits in Europe. You talk about confronting Vladimir Putin. The best way to do that is to take away his energy money that he gets. Where's the section to develop the LNG resources for Ukraine in this agreement?
I think that the agreement in itself that actually provides greater certainty, and with the new chapters on services, which are engineering services that will actually come from the ancillary work that comes, for those companies to be in that space.
So there's no section on that. So effectively, in Canada, you and the Prime Minister are pausing the carbon tax on certain parts of Canadians, while at the same time imposing a carbon tax in a trade agreement on a country in the middle of the war. I think your priorities on this trade agreement are absolutely wrong.